Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. In our final conversation with Dr. Matt Harris, we're going to talk about J. Edgar Hoover's thoughts on Ezra Taft Benson and Martin Luther King Jr. It's going to be a really fun conversation. It seems that Benson thought highly of Hoover, but Hoover didn't think highly of Benson. It's a very interesting conversation. I hope you check it out. I'd also like to remind you to please check out Matt's book, Thunder from the Right. It's a fantastic book, and it's got a lot of these stories as well as a lot of other things in there. So please check that out. Also, I'll have transcripts out shortly for subscribers, so please subscribe on our website. Now back to our conversation.
Yeah, J. Edgar Hoover's the first high-profile official that will float the idea that King's a commie. And one of the reasons, and the Birchers will pick up on this, Robert Welch, and then by extension, Ezra Taft Benson. But one of the reasons why that Hoover thinks he's a commie is because Dr. King has two very close associates that work with him. One's a black man named Baird Rustin, and the other one is a white guy named Levinson, Sandy Levinson. And both of them had been associated with the Communist Party some 2 decades before they met Dr. King, especially Levinson. He was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And this was back in the Depression when 25% of Americans are out of work. And so there's a lot of people who thought that capitalism had failed them. And so they had embraced various other isms to challenge capitalism, essentially. So anyway, not surprising, there was a spike in Communist Party rolls in the 1930s because of the perceived failure of capitalism. And in my humble opinion, that's one of the great things about Franklin Roosevelt. He saves capitalism during its darkest hour. But anyway, so these two guys had these affiliations with the Communist Party, especially Levinson. Baird Rustin was just tangentially connected. But what's clear about it is that by the time they were with Dr. King's very sensitive to this. And he's been called a commie and this and that. And he knows that these two guys were part of the party, but he warned them, look, you're done with that. And they, no problem. I haven't been involved in the Communist Party in 15, 20 years. And so Hoover knew this. He had been wiretapping Dr. King, and he knew this. He knew that Dr. King didn't like communism. And Dr. King certainly had some socialist leanings. There's no question about that. But to call him a communist is absolutely remiss. And so that's where you get that connection with communism, these two erstwhile communist members who became his close associates. And he warned them, if you have any associations, it'll ruin me in the movement. And so he made that very clear to them. And what happened was that the Birchers had picked up on this communist stuff from a training school that Dr. King had gone to in 1957. It's called the Highlander Training School. It's in Tennessee. And essentially it's a social justice training school. So you can go there and promote ideas of social justice, not just racial stuff, but also economic and other things. So obviously it's very progressive. And a lot of African Americans will go there to learn about nonviolence and how to protest, segregation. Rosa Parks, the late great Rosa Parks, will also go there. Well, Dr. King had never been there before, and they asked him to come in to give a speech, I think, on some anniversary celebration. So he goes there once. I think the evidence is pretty clear. He only was there once. And when word shows up that Dr. King is going to go there, this is 1957, there's an undercover operative who will see Dr. King there sitting next to a communist, because some communists did go there. A few did, anyway. And so he's sitting next to a communist. He'd never met the man before. Takes his picture when he's sitting next to this communist, and the Birchers will use this picture to smear Dr. King. See, he's a commie. He's at a communist training school. Well, there's nothing communist about this school at all. In fact, the founder was a white guy who was not a communist. But anyway, this is how politics works. If you want to smear people and destroy them or try to destroy them, take a picture and publicize it. And so Dr. King is, when he learns what the Birchers have done with this picture, he's just mortified. He'd never been there before. He didn't know anybody there. So anyway, by the 1960s, J. Edgar Hoover convinces the Kennedy administration to give him a wiretap, to wiretap Dr. King. And Bobby Kennedy will later regret this. Bobby Kennedy's the president's brother. He's the attorney general, the highest law enforcement officer in the United States. So Hoover convinces Bobby Kennedy that we need to have a wiretap for this very dangerous civil rights leader. And so Bobby Kennedy gives the green light, and they're listening, Hoover's listening to all of this stuff. And he knows, again, Dr. King's feelings about communism because he hears it on tape. But Hoover is determined to destroy King because he thinks he's a dangerous leader. And he has so many people at his beck and call to march through the streets and to protest and to create, bedlam in, certain American cities. And so he wants to destroy Dr. King, and the best way to do that is to link him with communism. And the Birchers will pick up on this, and some other Mormon, Cleon Skousen will pick up on this too. And so in right-wing circles, Dr. King becomes associated with communism because of his association with those two former communists in his inner circle, and also having had his picture taken at the Highlander School in 1957. And that's why he gets tarnished with communism. But there's no question, I want to be clear though, there's no question that Dr. King's politics become very aggressive in the months leading up to his death in 1968, April of 68. He's denouncing the Vietnam War. He's denouncing the war on poverty. It's not doing enough for black folk. And he's calling for economic equality, which, certainly if you're talking about economic equality and certain income levels that Americans, including black folks, need to have, then that, of course, starts to move in the direction of socialism. But he didn't have any patience for communism at all, and he thought that communist experiments in Southeast Asia and other places were abysmal failures. He was a very close student of politics. So that's where all this politics stuff goes from. And to be fair to Elder Benson, he doesn't know any of the truth. He doesn't know that Hoover's trying to smear King. And Benson's inherited all this stuff from the Birchers, and Hoover. He admires Hoover. He thinks Hoover's wonderful. So he doesn't know the agenda that Hoover has. And I guess I'll end the story here. That Hoover is exposed in the early 1970s for going after King and trying to ruin him. Maliciously ruin him. And he gets exposed. And that's how essentially he ends his long-standing FBI career in the early 70s. They have hearings that, it's a complicated story, but there are documents that get leaked, FBI documents that expose Hoover and the internal workings of the FBI. And when these documents get leaked, there's an informant who steals these documents and leaks them to the Washington Post and New York Times. And it reveals this top secret government organization that exists for the sole purpose of destroying Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And once that's leaked, and there's some other things going on too, Hoover goes after student radicals protesting Vietnam. But once those kinds of things are leaked to the press, that's what leads to Hoover's downfall. And as this stuff is going on in the early 70s, Hoover's under intense scrutiny from congressional committees. Like, what are these documents we've been reading in the Washington Post? Are they authentic? And of course, Hoover's trying to figure out who's leaking. He's massive manhunt to figure out who's doing the leaking. And never finds them. And so these leaked documents bring him down. And Benson will write him letters in the early 70s. We have these letters from his FBI files, some of which will be published in my documentary history book. And he says that the leakers are part of a vast international communist conspiracy to bring you down. You're a great patriot and a great American. So Benson refuses to see the evidence against J. Edgar Hoover. And to the day that Hoover dies, Benson is writing him letters of support. And even as late as 1984, I can't explain this, but as late as 1984, when just before President Benson becomes the church president, he gives this talk in Northern Virginia, and he brings up Hoover in the talk. It's quite extraordinary. He says Hoover was maligned, viciously maligned by a communist conspiracy. By this point, Hoover had been dead for 10 years.
Wow. And
Benson felt the need to defend him. But arguably, two of the most important non-church or non-Mormon influences on Benson was J. Edgar Hoover and Robert Welch. Bar none. So, and he's pretty clear in his letters of expression to both those men about their influence on him.
So he really liked Hoover, but Hoover didn't like him.
Correct. Yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, Hoover was always cordial in replies back to Benson, but he would always say, either Hoover would say or his assistants would say that, I'm busy, I can't make it. Thank you for inviting me. Mr. Secretary, to speak at BYU, but Hoover would say, I can't make it, things like that. But in private, Hoover's writing memos saying, I just can't talk to the Bensons because they're associated with the Burt Society. And the big hookup for Hoover is this whole idea with Eisenhower Kami. Hoover knew Ike, thought he was an honorable man, and also knew members of his cabinet. And so that was just over the top. Right. Yeah, and if you look at The Politician, in subsequent editions, they took all the harsh stuff out. So all the commies, they're still pretty critical of Eisenhower, but they take away, they take out, omit the direct charges that he and his cabinet are all commies.
Well, great. So one last question that I wanted to ask, and then we'll let you go. This has gone on a long time, so I really appreciate your time. So, much to the chagrin of many of my friends on Facebook, Donald Trump has a greater than 50% approval rating in Utah. And so, as we talked about President Benson, do you think that that's really, what would President Benson think of President Trump?
Oh boy. Well, his behavior denigrating the CIA and the FBI and publicly humiliating his cabinet. I mean, President Trump's a cad. He's a bore. And President Benson would have no patience for that. I mean, President Benson was always a proper man. And he had great respect for America's institutions. And this current president does not. So I think President Benson would find that utterly repulsive to think that President Trump could be so contemptuous of our branches of government and our traditions. But in terms of politics, I mean, I guess we'd have to disaggregate it. Certainly, President Benson was a supply-sider. He believed that the wealthiest Americans ought to have the largest tax breaks to stimulate the economy. I mean, that's pretty clear. President Benson's a Tea Party guy before there was a Tea Party. I mean, that's the short answer to all of this. President Benson would probably share in some of President Trump's views on immigration. I think that you could make a clear case for that. I think that there's no question with the Supreme Court, the nominations. President Benson was very clear that there is an original meaning to the Constitution, and somehow we have to nominate justices that would interpret the Constitution as the founders would want it to be interpreted. I find that hard to believe. Like there's some fixed meaning frozen in time with guys in periwigs and breeches, but whatever. A little humor after a long interview. But so a lot of the conservative politics, I think that President Trump has embraced. There's no question President Benson has embraced. But his behavior, especially towards women, just over the top. Mm-hmm. But he would find President Trump a cad. Yeah, and I would think that he would think that there are other presidents who more befitting of the office with their temperament than this billionaire playboy from New York.
So he'd probably more be a Ted Cruz, Mike Lee kind of a fan.
Oh, I hope not. Unfortunately, yes, probably. And maybe a Mitt Romney guy. I mean, maybe Brother Romney would. Maybe his politics would be palatable to President Benson.
Did he say anything about George Romney?
There was always a distance between those two. Especially
because they were more rivals.
They were rivals. Yeah, there was a distance between those two. I've gone through some of the Romney papers, and I haven't seen any Benson correspondence, which is interesting. But I had, in the Romney papers, there is Stuart Udall correspondence, the Secretary of Interior. I'll just tell you this quick story. Udall was coming out publicly in the 60s about the ban. And he wrote Romney. He said, wouldn't it be great if you came out too, and called it to the attention of the national news media. And it just shows you that these two men were at different trajectories in their church affiliation. Udall hadn't been active in the church for a long time, and felt, even though he was very sensitive to his culture and his upbringing, he sent letters of the letter that he published in Dialogue, that's what it is a letter he published in Dialogue expressing his essentially contempt for the priesthood ban. But he sent the letter to Elder Kimball and Elder Stapley, Delbert Stapley, both Arizona apostles that he knew because he's from Arizona. He also sent it to the First Presidency as a courtesy. And so he was sensitive to what he was saying and to the church he loved. But clearly he wasn't afraid to voice his opinion. And he asked George Romney for help We thought it would be a 1-2 punch. And it's really, I think, a contrast between these two important men in the 60s, that one will denounce it openly and the governor will just do it privately. And Romney writes him back, I can't do what you're doing. I want to remain faithful in the church. And so that's what happens. Yeah.
All right, we'll wrap this up. So I really appreciate you taking so much time here on Gospel Tangents. I'd love to talk to you again, especially about your gospel topics. I think you've got some interesting stuff, and we didn't even touch any of that. So hopefully we can do another interview in the future.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, that's fun. All right. I told you we could cover some ground.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matt Harris, and I'd like to thank him for spending so much time talking with us. He's a fountain of knowledge, and it's been really cool talking about all this more modern history. I'd also like to encourage you to buy his book, Thunder from the Right, on Ezra Taft Benson. So it's a fantastic book, and it's going to be great. So thanks again, Matt. In our next conversation, we'll talk a little bit about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I've got Barbara Jones Brown. She's helping to write a book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre with Rick Turley. So is there any evidence that Brigham conspired with the Indians in that massacre?
So privately, Young's interpreters are encouraging Indians to raid immigrant cattle trains going through, so that it plays into this strategy of trying to convince the federal government to leave the Mormons alone where they are.
We'll have a transcript out shortly on this conversation, and you can purchase individual copies at our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. If you want to be the first to get a copy, please subscribe on our website for just $10 a month. I'll send it to you first as a PDF. Or if you'd like a physical copy, for $15 a month, I'll be happy to send that to you as well. You can get our transcripts at our Amazon.com author page. I've got a link here, but just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview and you should be able to find a bunch of them there. Please subscribe at patreon.com/gospeltangents. For $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview uncut. And for $10, you can get a PDF copy. We've also got a $15 tier where if you want a physical copy, I'll be the first to send it to you. So please subscribe at Patreon or on our website at gospeltangents.com as well. For our latest updates, please like our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. And also check our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents as well. Please subscribe on our Apple Podcasts page at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, or you can subscribe on your Android device. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.